Well, good evening and welcome to our Saturday evening live stream here from the studios in Texoma land. Some of you might know us as Sherman or maybe North Texas, but most of us here in the region just simply call it Texoma. So we're glad that you've connected with us this evening. Hope you're having a great weekend. We're enjoying another change in the weather, which is typical here in our neck of the woods. And so one day you'll have 30-mile-an-hour winds from the north, and then you'll skip a day. Then the following day you have 30-mile-an-hour winds from the south. I told my wife when she moved to Texas with me that if you ever lost something, if you dropped something, just stand in the same place because the wind will blow it away, but 2 days later it's blowing it back. So anyway, I hope you're having a great weekend. Of course, we're continuing on with our series for the month of May entitled Gatekeepers, and kind of a challenging topic in the sense that I had never heard anyone speak about gatekeepers, but this is the way God directed me in my studies, and I've been digging into His Word. Very enjoyable, unearthing some treasures, and those I'm sharing with you again in the month of May. One of the things that we've presented during the course of this series is a definition of biblical gatekeepers, and a definition of those biblical gatekeepers are those guards who were strategically stationed for protection at any kind of gate. And in the Hebrew world, there were three primary types of gates: the city gates, the palace gates where the king resided, and then of course the temple gates. And so their duties or their responsibility, what they were tasked to accomplish, was to protect unwanted people from entering through the city gates. And you could imagine in the olden days, but in the biblical times, where the only defense were the gatekeepers to determine if they were friend or foe as they were coming toward the city, and then second of all to guard the unruly people from entering into the palace gates, and then thirdly keeping or guarding, preventing what we would call in the scriptural sense unclean people from entering the temple gates. And so that was their task, that was their responsibility. Now, in similar fashion, modern day gatekeepers shoulder the responsibility for standing in the gap for their country, or you might call it, the Greek word is oikos, your sphere of influence, but your country, your family, and then your personal self as you're undertaking or undergoing your faith journey. The modern day gatekeepers' role for themselves as well as others is virtually important now as it was for the gatekeepers of the Old Testament. Now, why is that the case? Why is the role of the modern day gatekeeper equally as important as the gatekeepers, the biblical gatekeepers mentioned in the Old Testament? Well, that's because the enemy of everything that is just and right, and everyone who seeks to live and serve God, that enemy, Satan, has in his crosshairs all of the people and all of the purposes of God. And so Peter in the New Testament says in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8, your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. And so the enemy of who? Who's your enemy? Well, again, not only the purposes of God, but even more directly, the people of God. So if you right now, today, are a follower of Christ, you are in the crosshairs of Satan, and he is doing whatever he can to seek you out, and we'll just say it in these terms, to mess you up, to distract you, or even to destroy you. Now, Peter had experienced this firsthand, the various strategies of the devil. And so he had experienced Satan's effort to distract Simon Peter, distract him, his mind away from dwelling on the things of God. Now, in Matthew chapter 16, verse 23, just as a point of reference, you may recall that that Peter had made his infamous declaration that you are the Messiah, that you are the Christ. And Jesus said, well, you didn't come up with that on your own. That is inspired by the Holy Spirit. I'm paraphrasing. And then Peter was trying to change or to alter God's plan. And in that verbiage, Jesus says to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan." So you see that Peter himself had come to the place where he was experiencing the enemy's tactics or strategies to divert or to distract Simon Peter's mind from the things of God. And that's exactly what Jesus says. You do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of men. So Peter had experienced that. But second of all, we find that Peter experienced the enemy, the devil's effort to distress his heart from trusting in God. Now, when you're finding yourself distressed by the enemy, ultimately you will find yourself in despair. And so Peter in Matthew chapter 14, if again you remember the storyline that Jesus had sent the disciples away so he could spend some time by himself in solitude and silence, praying and kind of getting his mind refocused. And he comes to the disciples while they are out on the Sea of Galilee, and a storm had arisen. It was kind of a stormy looking day, eerie day. And when the disciples saw, the people in the boat saw this figure walking on the water, they kind of panicked. And then so Jesus establishes himself as, "Hey, it's me." And Peter says, "Well, can I come to you?" And so Jesus says, "All right, come." And Peter, as it says in Matthew 14, went over the side of the boat and walked on the water toward Jesus. And he was doing fine until he began to distress and become despaired about all of the things that were happening around him. He was terrified and began to sink. And so Simon Peter had discovered or experienced firsthand the enemy's attempts to make him despair or to distress and keep Peter from trusting in God. But lastly, we see that Peter had also experienced the enemy's effort, the devil's effort to destroy his soul from desiring and defending the things of God. And so when Jesus was again interacting with Simon Peter, Jesus said, "Well, all of you will fall away tonight before the evening has finished." And this is right before his betrayal and then the trials and the crucifixion. And Peter said, impetuous Peter said, "Well, everybody except for me, I won't fall away." And Jesus says to him in that very moment that before the cock crows, you will have denied me 3 times. Peter, no way, not me. But the enemy was seeking to devour or destroy Simon Peter's soul from desiring and defending the things of God. And so ultimately, as you see in this verse found in Luke chapter 22, that Peter denied that he was a follower of Christ 3 times, and then the cock crows. Now, I mentioned these because the efforts of the devil that Simon Peter had experienced had worked. These same strategies, these same acts of the enemy, of Satan, the devil, had worked with Adam and Eve. They obviously were effective against Simon Peter, but they were also used against Jesus. So no surprise, even though they weren't effective with Jesus, but they worked everywhere else. So it's no surprise that our enemy, the devil, applies them to each of our lives. Anyone who desires to follow Christ will encounter these kinds of strategies by Satan to distract, to distress, or to destroy your relationship with Christ. That's why Jesus warned his disciples, followers like you and I in today's world, that we will be persecuted. The people of the world will persecute you because you belong to me. It's not so much us as it is that Satan and the world despise people who follow Christ. So he says, for they don't know God who sent me. Jesus simply saying, if a person isn't a follower of his, they will wind up persecuting those who are followers of Christ. Now, how effective then are these tactics, these strategies? How effective has Satan been in your life? Bear in mind, our enemy only focuses on those who seek to find Jesus and or follow him. He's not concerned with people who are apathetic, lethargic, pathetic, or even moralistic, those people who are self-righteous in their own minds. Satan's attention is squarely on those who desire to love God with their heart, soul, mind, and strength, and those who desire to serve God, and those who desire to give God first place in their lives, to give God the best they have and the most they can. Those are the individuals that the devil focuses on. Simply put, those who are fully committed to God, Satan persecutes. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 10, part of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says to those who are followers, to those who are being persecuted, you're blessed when your commitment to God provokes persecution. Well, my guess is you don't necessarily view these inconveniences, these disruptions in your life in that regard. But Jesus says we should. Just because we don't doesn't mean we're right. Jesus says you're blessed when your commitment to God provokes persecution. Then he says why you should feel blessed, because the persecution drives you even deeper into God's kingdom. Even deeper into God's kingdom. So remember, what God allows to happen in your life is never designed to destroy your faith, only to develop your character and deepen your commitment. Well, if there's one thing I would invite you to hang on to in the weeks ahead is that statement, that whatever God allows to challenge you or to come into your life, never designed or permitted to destroy you, but to develop your life, to deepen your commitment to him and develop your character. So let's go back to the gatekeepers. The gatekeepers' defense, as I mentioned last weekend, is to possess the right tools for their task as a gatekeeper, their task and their work, and to be proficient with those tools. Last weekend, that's what we talked about, but we add one more element this weekend, and that is the gatekeepers' defense in their task, their role, their responsibility in protecting the city gates, the palace gates, the temple gates, or as we've said, your country, your family, and your faith journey, your personal faith journey, is not only to possess the right tools, be proficient with those tools, but be perceptive about the traps set by the devil. So in the 40s and 50s, which I understand most of us weren't alive then, but if you were, or you've been a part of some of the byproducts of the 40s and 50s, you may remember this phrase that was from a 1939 movie featuring Judy Garland called The Wizard of Oz. And in that movie, as the Tin Man and Scarecrow, along with Judy Garland and the dog Toto, they're making their way down the yellow brick road towards the Emerald City. And this song, this thing came up, a phrase which was lions and tigers and bears. And if you're familiar with that, I don't know hardly anyone who's not seen this movie, but lions and tigers and bears, you know the next part of that is, oh no. Lions and tigers and bears, oh no, is the verbal response. So for those of us who want to modernize this just a little bit, that idiom has been altered and given a little bit of a twist in our modern times for those situations where we are in awe or apprehensive or fearful. So if you would, for instance, talk about the internet, people who are on the internet may say, oh, hackers and scammers and trolls, oh no. Or if you're in the Texoma area and going up and down 75, US 75, you may say, oh, potholes and detours and delays, oh no. Well, gatekeepers have their own little idiom about their concerns, which say traps and trickery and treachery, oh no. And it's a reminder that the enemy is constantly, as Peter said, prowling about seeking someone to devour. The traps and the trickery and the treachery, oh no, are evident when you are attentive to the things that are happening around you. Biblical gatekeepers, as well as modern day gatekeepers, are not immune or exempt from hard times or difficult days. When you stand at the front gate, you're therefore the frontline defense against any invading enemy or assailant's effort. Whether you're protecting and standing in the gap for your country, your family, or your own personal faith journey, you need to have a spiritual perspective of the enemy along with a spiritual preparedness. So this morning, we look at the words of David found in Psalm 140 and look and study what David shares regarding the gatekeeper's trappings. Now, I understand nowhere in the Old Testament is David referred to as a gatekeeper. A lot of other titles. He was the shepherd. He was the armor bearer. He was the assailant of Goliath. He was the king. All of these other titles, but never that of a gatekeeper. But by definition, according to David's task and his works, by definition of a gatekeeper he was a gatekeeper for the Hebrew nation, his family, and obviously his own heart. Now, as a gatekeeper, David's life, and especially his writings, reveal the dangers and pitfalls of someone serving as in this role as a gatekeeper and shouldering those responsibilities. So what can we learn from David? Looking at Psalm 140, hope that you've opened up your Bible app, maybe your favorite Bible version, looking at Psalm 140. Now, it is there, first off, as a gatekeeper that David shows us or tells us that as gatekeepers, he was aware and alert to his trappings. Now, some people go through life totally unaware of the things that are happening around them. And there's a danger in that. When we drive on the highway, I was taught always drive defensively, not paranoia, but drive defensively. And so as we go into areas, we're kind of aware of others, what they're doing, what traffic is doing behind us or front of us, as well as behind us. Now, in Psalm 140 and in the following 4 Psalms, they all share a common theme as David, supposedly David, writing all of these Psalms, talks about preservation and deliverance. And as I mentioned, David penned all of these apparently as in those times when he was being pursued and persecuted by Saul. Now, one of these Psalms 140 through 144 is referred to as the prayer when David was in the cave. But we also find in this particular psalm that David is complaining somewhat, we all understand this, about the malice of his enemy, and in that he prays for God's help in persevering. So if you're looking at Psalm 140, or if you're following along in your sermon guide, so if by chance you don't have one of these and would like one, make sure you let me know. We'll be glad to send those in advance to the live stream so that you can follow along. But in this verse 5, excuse me, David says, the proud hid a trap for me. They spread out a net beside the road. So not only is it deceptive, but it's a disguise. Rarely does the enemy come up and say, here I am, draw your sword. The devil prowls about like a roaring lion, very sneaky. And so David says, the proud hid a trap. They spread out a net beside the road. They set traps for me. And then there's this incredible Hebrew word translated Selah. It's a musical term. And if you know much about music, you know that at certain points where you're playing along, there will be what they call a rest, R-E-S-T. Could be a half beat, a whole beat, but there's a rest. That's what Selah means. It's like in those times when you go, it's that exhale moment. It's that rest. And so David says, the proud hid a trap for me. They spread out a net beside the road. They set traps for me. Selah. David says we need to be aware and alert to our trappings. It is certainly unwise to step into an unfamiliar situation or territory without an awareness and alertness to the trappings. When I was growing up, I was the youngest of all of the kids. So mom and dad and all of their friends, the other families had older children, more my brother's age. And so when I came along, I was instantly youngest of everyone. And there was a time when one of mom's best friends, her son, who was about 5-6 years older than me, for some reason, they let me go with him. His name was Michael Sullivan. But they allowed me to go with Mike, and Mike had his friends and some that were just a tad older than him. And I don't know what the conversation was, but these 4 or 5 young boys, young men, decided, well, they would take me out into the country. Now, those of you who have followed along for a while realize I am a country boy. And so most of my life was spent away from the house, out in the woods, roaming around. And you gain a sense of direction. And so you're constantly aware of, I got here, but how do I get home? And so they took me out to this remote wooded area, and we traipsed into the woods. They parked their vehicles. We actually had 2 vehicles, and so they walked me back into the woods, and they were snickering as we were going back. So I was kind of aware that something was going on. And so they said, well, you're gonna stay here, count to 100, hide and go see, count, and we're going to go hide. And so I, started counting, and I could hear them as they ran out. And so I was like, oh, no, we're not playing this game. And so I got to 10, looked around, and I could hear them out in the woods. They weren't at all knowledgeable about how to hide or how to get around in the woods. And I just in my own mind said, well, this is ludicrous. And so I left and went back to where the two cars were parked. And so I could hear them, like, well, how do we get back to the cars? But the point is, you need to be aware and alert to the trappings. When Jesus was teaching his disciples, he says, is there anyone here who planning to build a new house doesn't first sit down and figure the cost so they'll know if they can complete it? And so there is this element of calculation, or really what he's saying about being aware and alert to the trappings of life. So how many people do you know around you who you would say, yeah, I think they bit off more than they can chew? Here's just a little bonus to the message. Eagerness does not always equate to effectiveness. Just because somebody really is hepped up about a project or some undertaking doesn't mean that they're going to complete it, doesn't mean that they're even going to be effective. We all face limitations due to our resources and or our competency. Another way of putting it is, people often have blind spots in their lives, blind spots to their vulnerabilities and their very own weaknesses. The trappings of a gatekeeper include such items as a lack of rest. We expend all of our energy thinking that we're just invincible, which is not the case. The trappings of a gatekeeper consist of a lack of rest, a longing for recognition. The gatekeepers, again, as I've mentioned, were assigned a position. They weren't in a culture where they were trying to, move up the corporate ladder to gain more prestige. But in our modern day world, that's a trapping, our longing for recognition, a desire to, hey, look at me, what I have done or I am doing, rather than simply serving. Another trapping is lingering regrets. And let me just say, we all, if we could have do-overs in our life, would have done something different. It doesn't matter who you are. We all would have liked to have not said something or said something, not done something or done something. But those regrets about, well, we made a mistake and we can't undo that. It's happened. And yet if we tie into that and we get bogged down with it, then we're falling into the traps. The trap that Satan uses is when we have lingering regrets. It's the hardest to forgive yourself. You can forgive others. It's the hardest to forgive your own self. Another trapping is listening to faulty reasoning. Very easy to get convinced in our society what people are saying is right. It may not be right, it may not be good, but they're certainly saying it loud and long. And then lastly, and this is probably the biggest trap, the biggest snare, lasting rebelliousness. Now, again, I'm not going to go off on a tangent here, but in our culture, lasting rebelliousness, you may be thinking, well, I don't rebel against God, but do you ever rebel against God's leaders? I was talking to someone just a few months ago, and they were talking about the political climate. And I had said to them, well, did you vote? And they said, well, I sure did. I said, but are you spending now then any time praying for these leaders that apparently God desired to be in office for the time being? And they, well, God didn't want them. Well, then you explain why they're there. And the Bible is clear, especially in the New Testament, that we are to pray for those who are in authority over us. May not agree, may not like them, may not know them or want to hang with them, but we still need to pray for them. So this lasting rebelliousness towards God and towards God's plan. A modern day gatekeeper needs to be perceptive when it comes to the trappings of the devil. To ignore the signs and warnings would be much like a person driving down US Highway 75 blindfolded. There's no way you would even venture to attempt that. John writes in 1 John chapter 2 and says, for all that is in the world, and then he describes three areas or three categories, but everything that is in the world is going to pass away. None of these things in the world are going to last. The only thing that will endure, the only thing that will last is those who serve God, love God, who are accomplishing his will. They will abide forever. So David simply says to the gatekeepers, as one he is saying to others, those in the biblical and Old Testament days, but also to modern day gatekeepers, we need to be aware and alert to the trappings that our enemy is setting for our demise. Secondly, as a gatekeeper, David admitted his need and asked for help. People in our culture are far too self-reliant and independent. Now, I understand I live in Texas and we by nature are independent, but we've lost sight of the need and value of neighborly help, thinking that we'll somehow become indebted to a person simply because they lent us a helping hand. I mean, we'll suffer through all kinds of things, all kinds of projects. We'll attempt to do it our way, by ourselves, only by ourselves, and forego the obvious. That there are people around us who are willing to help and would be more than capable to help us. The wisdom literature says that pride goes before destruction and haughtiness before a fall. Pride is a big pill to swallow. In fact, spiritually, pride can choke a person to death. That appears to be the biggest stumbling block in people crying out to God and coming to him in their time of despair. And yet that's the very reason that God is our ally, that he is there for us. Could you imagine someone who is, like incredibly ill, and they'll say, well, hey, why don't we go down to the hospital? It's just around the block, and them saying, oh, no, not me. I'll just suffer through it. Most people would say, yeah, take me down. And what we need to realize spiritually, that God is our physician. He's the one who can help. Now, in this moment, Psalm 140, David calls out to God. And in verse 6, he says to the Lord, all caps, and you know that means Yahweh, which references the covenant God of the Hebrew nation. I said to the covenant God, the God I'm connected to, you are my God. Wow. That's significant. God, the covenant God of the Hebrew nation, you are my God. So Lord, the covenant God of Hebrew and my God, listen to my prayer for help. So note the two confessions that are a part of David's plea. He declares his relationship, the covenant relationship he has with the Lord, but he also admits his complete dependency on God's help. So not only does he confess this connection to God, he confesses his need for God's care. Now, in Psalm 102, there is another psalmist, an unnamed psalmist, but another psalmist who writes a prayer, who is heard and in need of help. And in Psalm 102, there in verses 1 through 2, this particular psalmist says, hear my prayer, Lord. Let my cry for help come to you. Do not hide your face from me when I am in distress. Turn your ear to me when I call. and as if this was a part of our culture, answer me quickly. Now, there's a degree of impatience, but in their distress, they knew that they were in a place of desperation and they needed God's help immediately. God now, God now. And I understand many people pray in that regard. But what we need to understand, as David, as a gatekeeper, advises us, is that we need to admit our need and ask for help. It's one thing to say to others or to say to ourselves, man, this is overwhelming. But to turn to God and say, God, I really need your help. There's no shame in asking for help, only silliness in avoiding or refusing God's help. And then lastly, as a gatekeeper, David prepared so as to prevent being snared. Now, if you were going on a hike, or as my brother and I have experienced going on a canoe trip, you would be proactive in your preparations and plans. You'd probably take certain precautions and bring certain supplies. That doesn't mean you cease being careful. That's why most car accidents tend to happen close to home. People drop their guard and become susceptible to accidents because they're familiar with their surroundings. So this is the advice Jesus gave to his followers in Matthew chapter 10, verse 16. Behold, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves, so be. So if you're looking at in your sermon guide, that's the phrase, so be, so be. So be what? So beware, so be prepared, so be shrewd as serpents and innocent as doves. Now, David, again, Psalm 140, verse 4. So kind of in a reverse order here, 5, 6, and then back to verse 4. He says, Lord, again, here's the covenant God of the Hebrew nation. David has said, you're my God, not only to the Hebrew nation, but personally. Lord, guard me from the power of wicked people. Protect me from cruel people who plan to trip me up. David was being proactive in preparing himself from evil, violent, and wicked men. That's what he references back in verse 1 through 2. Do you have any people in your life that are detrimental to your well-being? Probably. Maybe not a lot, I hope. But David says, I'm looking at these people who are around me, and they're prone to evil. They're violent. They're wicked. And so God, guard me from these individuals. Sometimes you can be in a place like a neighborhood, or you're working in an environment and it's adversarial. And you could vacate it, but there's a chance that God has you there to shine your light for him, shine his light for the kingdom. And so a part of our daily prayer should be, God, protect me from these who are evil, these who are detrimental, these who are not followers of Christ. Protect me. Help me to be wise. Help me to be aware. Help me to be prepared and prevent me from their traps and snares. Now, David's preparation against being ensnared is the same for modern day gatekeepers. And that is, David uses prayer and surrender. And that's exactly what you and I need to incorporate into our lives each and every day. Prayer and surrender. We should pray to God first thing in the morning and then stay in that attitude of prayer throughout the day. We should pray to God, but we should also surrender to God. Stop trying to change God's plan. Stop trying to become adversarial towards God's will for your life. So surrender to God. Follow the footsteps, or follow the steps that God has laid out there before you. Another way I've said it for years is we need to turn to God and we need to trust in God. Now, if you still have your Bibles or your Bible app open, you can just glance down at verse 7, because in verse 7, David thanks God for his help. And in the closing two verses of this psalm, verses 12 and 13, David speaks of his confidence in God and emphasizes the assurance God's people can have in their times of turmoil and troubles. Can have. So you still need to understand what David is teaching us in this psalm, that we ourselves, we need to be aware and alert to the trappings that are around us. We need to admit those times, those moments when we are in need and ask God for his help. But we also need to take preventative measures. We need to be prepared in order to prevent ourselves from falling into the snares. Now, years ago, there was a TV show called Hill Street Blues. Some of you might be familiar with that. And nearly every episode, the sergeant, as he was giving out alerts and as he was talking about things that they need to, the officers needed to pay attention to, but right before he would dismiss these patrolmen, he would say, "Hey, let's be careful out there." The trappings set by your spiritual enemy and your worldly foes are real and dangerous. And so to each of you, as you are viewing this live stream, is, hey, let's be careful out there. Let's not try to hide from our duties, as the sergeant would say to the patrolman. We can't just sit in here in this room. We can't hide. We need to be in the world, because that's where we let our light shine for God. We're not to hide our light, but when we go out, we need to be aware, as Peter has said, of the trappings of our enemy, that the devil is prowling around, and we need to be aware. We need to admit those times when we're struggling, and we need to be prepared for what lies ahead. Be alert, admit your vulnerabilities, and ask for God's help. If you're a gatekeeper, which there's a real good chance you are, maybe not for our country, but there's a sphere of people, maybe where you live, in your neighborhood, or where you're working, or certainly for your family, your personal family. But you're a gatekeeper for your oikos, for your country, for your family, but certainly for yourself as you undertake this journey of faith. Satan, the devil, the enemy, is going to do everything to prevent you from loving God, serving God, and giving to God. He did these strategic moves against Jesus, and he's going to do them against you. But just be strong, beware, and be prepared. God will enable you to be victorious, so that you can ultimately give praise and glory and honor to him. Well, thanks for connecting with us tonight for this live stream. We're praying for you. Appreciate the time that you're giving to us. Hope that you're being encouraged and certainly equipped to serve God in a deeper manner. But we look forward to being with you next weekend as we conclude this series on the Gatekeepers. And until then, may God's love and grace touch and surround your life in a dynamic and real way. God bless you.